Buenos días.
So first of all, I'd like to say good morning to everybody. I'm going to use my language, Spanish, and if possible, if you could please put on your headsets. The interpreters would like to communicate something to you at this particular point.
We're currently on day 24 of our industrial action against the management. No concessions have been made, and as a result, we will not be allowing any overruns today. Thank you very much.
De acuerdo, muchísimas gracias.
Well, thank you very much. And we will stick to the schedule. So we'll begin this particular meeting now. Esteemed members of the panel, colleagues, at this point I would like to welcome you, to welcome everybody. And I'd like to express my gratitude to the experts for their participation in this joint meeting, Tax 3. So I think indeed this will be extremely useful for our work, this particular joint meeting. Before giving the floor to the experts, I'd like to give the floor, first of all, to my colleague, Madam Esther de Lange, who is the Vice President of the Tax Press Committee. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And as you say, thank you very much for hosting, together with us, the Terror Committee and the Tax 3 Committee, this hearing, making the link between tax fraud and terrorism financing. It's a link that we're maybe not so used to making, or that we in any case didn't used to make until recently. At the end of 2016, a number of investigative journalists, including in my own country, the Netherlands, made a reportage showing that Al-Qaeda set up VAT carousel mechanisms involving companies all over Europe. And everything started with documents found at the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And after long investigations, notably by Italian prosecutors, the suspects were accused of stealing over €1 billion of tax money by committing VAT carousel fraud. To my knowledge, they were the first, or one of the first ones, to make the link between VAT carousel fraud and terrorism financing. I am therefore very pleased that we could organise this hearing jointly, and I look forward to hearing our experts who will be introduced, and then I pass the floor again to you by my colleague Valenciano.
Thank you very much. Bueno, vamos a empezar con el señor.
So we'll begin with Mr. Bob Elkier. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. Probably not. Please correct me. Feel free to correct me if I've mispronounced your name. So you're a journalist, investigating journalist, and you work for a Danish television, and you're responsible at this particular channel for financing of terrorism and the Eshel vigilance system. Participated in a number of different hearings in the Parliament with regard to this particular issue. The sources of financing of terrorism are sometimes legal, sometimes illegal. A bit of quiet, please. So the recent attacks have shown us the terrible consequences, and sometimes with very, very limited economic financial means or no financial means whatsoever, deadly attacks are possible. A number of different studies have been conducted by the Norwegian Defense Research Establishment from 1994 to 2003, showing that a number of different attacks are carried out with less than $10,000, and that there are numerous different cells that can provide these particular meager amounts or larger amounts. In 2016, the European Commission adopted an action plan in order to strengthen the fight against the financing of terrorism, fighting the sources, in other words, of financing. And Commissioner Moscovici emphasized that VAT fraud, and here we're speaking about €50 million, that there is the possibility that there are links between this particular fraud and the financing of terrorism. So you'll tell us a little bit about the fraud, the fight against fraud in terrorism, the funding in Denmark, the funding of terrorism, and how terrorist organizations are functioning thanks to the various lacunae that exist in the entire system. We'll hear a little bit about the experience in Spain as well. VAT fraud in Spain as well, and the links there to terrorism. After the presentation of our guest here and of our second guest as well, we'll have the opportunity to take questions from the audience. Thank you very much for your participation. You have the floor.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. As said, my name is Bo Elkjær. It's not easily pronounced. It's Danish, and Danish is a horrible language. I'll try to do my presentation in English. So, I'm here to talk about terror funding through VAT fraud, and I'm going to dig into one particular case that we disclosed in the Danish Broadcasting Corporation, DR, where I work, in cooperation with the Danish newspaper Jyllandsposten and the Swedish radio program E-Cuts. The case for this case starts on May 30, 2014, when 6 men were arrested in Melilla in Spain. They were charged with different terror charges and for recruiting 26 jihadists that were sent to fight in Sahel and other areas. What we found out was that 2 of these arrested suspected terrorists were directors in total 3 companies in Denmark. Another man was charged in the arrest, but was on the run. He was a director in a 4th company in Copenhagen. And these 4 companies were trading in different foodstuffs and soft drinks. And the companies were being used for VAT fraud in Denmark. The 4th man who was on the run, he was later killed in 2016 in Mali. He was killed by French special forces, I believe, as he was the leader of an Al-Qaeda fighting group in that area. So these were, for his case at least, hardened terrorists who was also a director in a soft drink selling company in Copenhagen. We started to investigate how this could be set up. How did these Spanish citizens appear as directors in companies in Denmark? And we found in our investigation 8 other Spanish citizens linked to the same group in Melilla who appeared as directors in different companies in Denmark. And all of these companies were linked to a large network of VAT fraud with other companies. This particular network where the terrorist links, we have 11 persons, Spanish citizens, and 24 companies, were part of a larger criminal network, a regular, so to speak, criminal enterprise. The Spanish-linked network, we have assessed in our research that they have defrauded the Danish government of something like 80 million kroners. That's a conservative estimate. That's more than 10 million euro in these 24 companies. Later, it has been disclosed that 3 of the companies has also been used in another fraud, which has been where the leading character has been convicted and sentenced in Denmark, and this network stole 85 million kroners through VAT fraud. Our investigation also showed that this Spanish network was linked to a similar network in Sweden, where other monies have been stolen in different sorts of VAT fraud. We dug into some of the goods that were used in this fraud. We found out that they were using soft drinks and candy, cars, electronics, cell phones, cheese from the Netherlands, chicken meat from the Netherlands. The cell phones and electronics were bought in Germany. And it was a very simple VAT fraud and VAT carousel fraud. Simply just in the VAT fraud, they just bought the goods from the Netherlands through a company that were later to be dissolved, and then traded it on with correct invoices, but including the VAT, and the price was total the same as the amount that used to purchase the goods, so they could sell it on to regular brokers in Denmark at a lower price than their competitors. The carousel fraud is a little more complicated, but we also found indications of that in this particular network. What we found out when we dug into how these Spanish citizens appeared in Danish companies was that they were part of a cell, a mosque, a radicalized mosque in Melilla in Spain. We found out that they had been radicalized by 2 Danish citizens that had traveled to Melilla. One is a Danish convert who died in Syria in 2013. Another has been arrested later. These people organized the cell down there and invited the members of the group to Denmark to participate as directors in this network. They also used Danish citizens. We found I was involved in a project where we tried to identify Danish citizens who had traveled to Syria to fight in the war down there. We identified positively 70 Danish citizens. Out of those, 16 were directors in different companies, and some of these companies are linked to this exact network. One of these persons, a Danish citizen, was director of 3 or 4 companies. He was killed in Syria in a drone attack in December 2015. The drone attack was targeting a car where he was riding with one Danish citizen who was involved in planning the Paris attack. So we have the planner of the Paris attack riding in a car with a director of different companies involved in VAT fraud in Denmark. VAT fraud linked to this particular cell. One of the Danish citizens we found was by now, the only Danish citizen who has been listed on the U.S. terrorism watch list, the specially designated global terrorist list, by executive order on September 23, 2014. He died of natural causes back in Denmark a couple of years back. But he was director in a company that was involved in this fraud. He was importing the cheese, he was importing the electronics from Germany, he was importing the chicken meat from the Netherlands and selling it down the road to companies 200 meters from his address, where it was then sold on to legitimate trades. In our investigation, we have also found, but not reported about yet, other citizens from other European countries that are involved in this. One person was set up as a director in a company in Denmark and then traveled on, and he was arrested on his way to Syria. And his case is still pending, I believe. So this is not just a problem between Sweden and Denmark and Spain. It's an issue that is linked to this. I'm not going to state names or something like that, but this is they are linked to an Islamic network that spans several European countries, and some of the Danish people in this network are highly placed and have leading roles. Some have been killed. It's mainly UK-based, but it's also present in Spain, in Denmark, in Belgium, in Holland, etc. I have been investigating VAT fraud since 2009. Am I running out of time? Oh, I didn't. 2 minutes. Okay. I'll do it very briefly, and we'll go back to it in the questions. I've been investigating this the VAT fraud since the carbon scandal back in 2009. Where the Danish carbon registry was being used for VAT fraud large scale in trading with carbon credits. Looking through this registry, I found out that the Danish registry was the largest of its kind. It had 1,256 accounts. After we disclosed the fraud network, this was cleaned up, and there was remaining 36 accounts. So this registry was a bulk register of VAT fraudsters. We investigated to ID these people and found out that some of these Danish citizens are linked to the case from 2014 in Italy, where there's a suspicion of a terrorism link, and it was out of this network that I tried to ID what are these people doing now. And when I looked up the names, I found out that the names were involved in food trading in Denmark. So these people have moved from carbon credits to electronics to different issues, and then onto food. They are not very discriminate in the choice of what they'll use as vehicle of fraud, just as long as they can sell it off very quickly. That was the main point I was going to. And the case in Italy is linked by persons directly to the case in Copenhagen with this Spanish network. That was my 2 minutes.
La verdad es que
Well, it's so interesting that I really don't want to interrupt you in any way, shape, or form, but we have a number of other guests. Thank you very, very much. Extremely interesting, and undoubtedly there'll be questions for you as well. At this point, I'd like to give the floor to Elena Hack. She's a presiding magistrate and a national member of the National Organization for the Prevention of Money Laundering. A magistrate in Romania with a lot of experience at the European level as well. You were the Romanian representative of Manival, the committee of experts which is in charge of evaluating and adopting measures against money laundering, established in 1997 by the Council of Europe. Your experience and your cooperation, your work in the courts in the fight against fraud and misappropriation of funds and tax evasion, of course, and also the funneling of funds for terrorism has been extremely important. So, Madam Hack, you have the floor for a maximum of 10 minutes as well. Thank you very much. You have the floor.
Good morning, Honorable President, dear colleagues. Thank you for the kindest invitation. My name is Elena Hack. I'm a prosecutor since 1998, meaning 23 years. In this time, I was liaison magistrate in Italy and also a short period ad interim member in the Superior Council of Magistracy. Starting with 2013, I am the representative of General Prosecutor Office attached to the High Court of Cassation and Justice in the board of the Romanian FIU, meaning Unit Financial Intelligence. For this, today I decided to presentation a study case which involves real cooperation and coordination between the Romanian FIU and the authority law informants, because without this coordination, this cooperation doesn't work a good fighting system against financing terrorism and money laundering. So, according to the information provided by the credit institution to which the company ABC has current accounts, on November 2015, the representatives of this company have ordered two transfers as follows. One transferred from one account into another account of the company, and the second transfer from one account into a different account of the company. Both transfers have been justified as related to the current activity of the company ABC. The amounts in respect of which has been ordered financial operation came from a collection of $150,000 recorded on March 2014 from the legal person DF. The transfer has been ordered from a bank account opened at a credit institution from Libya and had the justification of collection after delivery for export of goods. Following the date of registration for the external revenue above mentioned, the ABC was no longer included with external operation valued over 15,000 euro or equivalent. Suspicious elements identified in connection with the external revenue accords recorded in the ABC accounts were represented by the fact that part of transactions was conducted through money transfer services from residential areas of ISIS supporters. During 2013-2015, ABC has not recorded transaction on accounts held with credit institutions, although its activity was not suspended. Considering that by 2013, ABC has recorded cash transaction and external transaction on bank accounts, after one of the associates was declared undesirable, the company no longer conducted financial transaction. It is possible that this financial behavior intended to dissimulate that the company controllers have no longer had connections with Romania. Another argument in this regard is that the company presented to the credit institution where it holds accounts a number of empowerment documents prepared by the natural person T. Though through a document dated September 2015, the natural person T empowered the natural person Z, a Syrian citizen, that in his name and for him to establish any new commercial company with limited liability in accordance with the legislation in force, with me in quality of associate. Also, the natural person T, through the same notarial deed, empowered the natural person Z in relation to company ABC. Regarding the person in connection with the company ABC, the shareholders are the natural person T, Iraq citizen, the natural person X, Lebanese citizen. The natural person T, along with another natural person IR, were declared undesirable for a period of 15 years for developing activities related to propaganda and financial support of some jihadist groups in Middle East. In fact, the two foreigners were involved in facilitating illegal entry into the country of people from areas with terrorist issues. Those concerned have financially supported the presence in Romania of people with radical attitude. Other indicators of illicit activity of mentioned people refer to the commercial and financial operations conducted through the accounts of companies they own in Romania. In this respect, we mentioned that during 2012-2013, ABC recorded external collection of $2 million from entities in Libya, Bulgaria, and Marshall Islands. The amounts those collected were exchanged in lei and cash withdrawals from the account based on some questionable attainments note for animals purchased from natural persons. Also in June 2013, the company DRP, where individuality was associated until 2013 and the current shareholders are individual AY, Syrian citizen, and individual Z, recorded an external collection of $1 million from one account in Libya of a natural person justified as advance payment for export goods. The amount was changed in lei in several installments, and the result amounts were withdrawn in cash based on attainment notes. Financial behavior of ABC and DRP is unreliable and leads to the conclusion about the existence of money laundering offense as operation of cash withdrawals based on questionable document aimed at removing the source of funds illegally obtained and eliminating, if possible, the documentary evidence able to determine the money route. Moreover, there have been identified a series of successful transfers between the accounts of ABC and DRP companies recorded on the same day at different times or on consecutive days with exactly the same amounts of money. The transfers were completed to the accounts of individuals who control the companies, being justified as loan repayments to the associate or refounding company lending. The loan contracts in question were presented randomly without chronological order, some dating from 2002, given that the transactions were conducted in 2015. Another feature of the financial turnover analysis is the presence of numerous transfers of equal value below the reported limit provided by special law, made in several days between the two companies without purpose or economic real reason. This situation indicates the obvious intent to artificially increase the turnover of the companies involved and to reduce the tax base. Financial and taxing available data related to the economic activity of the companies controlled by individuality revealed that the declared value of the net debts to shareholders is less than the amount directed to the accounts of individuals involved with justification refounding company lending. The financial behavior identified on individuals and companies analyzed herein revealed the presence of a mechanism often used in the money laundering schemes typologies, money earned from tax evasion and other related offenses to the regime of commercial companies, such as multiple accounts credit, immediately followed by transfer to other accounts or cash withdrawals, mostly supported by loan agreements and attainment notes. Also corroborating the information available in this paper leads to the conclusion that the company ABC and DRP are still in the control of individual T by interposing the individual Z, and any operation to remove funds from the financial circuit are aimed at concealing the real beneficiary and to create an appearance of legality regarding the commercial and financial transaction with these entities in Romania. Given the profile of the individual T and taking into consideration that in relation to him support action for the jihadist movement in the Middle East have been identified, relevant facts are outlined about the existence of the offence of terrorist financing from revenue earned through economic activity of the company ABC and DRP. At the same time, there are some indications regarding the existence of the offence of terrorist financing in connection with individual Z acting in Romania in favour of individuality already declared undesirable. At the final of my presentation, I want to underline, I want to stress some thoughts. A good fighting system against financing terrorism and in the same time money laundering involves many players like financial institution, intelligence service, money laundering investigators, police, prosecution office. The steps are clearing, investigation and prosecution. Allow me, dear colleagues, to underline some theses regarding the prosecution of terrorist financing. Terrorism does not work without money. Investigating, prosecuting terrorist offences must include terrorist financing offences. Clarification of monetary flows can help us to sort out the structure of terrorist organizations. Findings in money laundering matters are an important starting point for terrorist financing proceedings. No abundance of information out of money laundering clearing, but selection and concentration on big cases. It is necessary to school money laundering investigators in terrorist financing matters and terrorist financing investigators in money laundering matters. No separation between prevention and repression, but interaction and cooperation. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, señora Hack.
Thank you very much, Madam Hack. The time is always limited, unfortunately, for these very, very interesting presentations. Thank you very much. Now I'll give the floor to Mr. Pedro Seixas Felicio. He's the unit chief of the Financial Crime Unit from Europol. Mr. Felicio is not only a member of the police force, but he is also a lawyer. He works in Europol and he deals, of course, with financial crime, counterfeit and corruption. So his participation in this roundtable will undoubtedly shed light on a number of issues concerning, for example, tax evasion, fraud and carousel fraud as well. I give you the floor, Mr. Felicio, for 10 minutes. And once again, thank you for being with us. Thank you.
I thank you, Chairman. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here and to represent Europol. My idea during this introductory remarks is to provide a little context and to focus on three things. What we do know about terrorism financing, what we know about VAT fraud, and what is the estimation of the percentage of VAT fraud that might be being used for terrorism financing purposes. So what we know about terrorism financing is something that was already mentioned here, that this is something crucial for all of the terrorist organizations. This is something that they need to survive. They need to have a constant access to large amounts of funding. In fact, it's so important to these terrorist organizations that 90% of all new terrorist organizations never get to survive their first year because they simply cannot have access to this large amount of funds, to this constant amount of funds. Studies even mention that Al-Qaeda in Iraq, for instance, they cannot survive for more than 4 to 6 weeks without having access to new funds coming in. Because these organizations, they do not have a central deposit, they do not have a reserve, they need to have constantly money coming in because this is money that they're using to pay for salaries. The second thing that we know about terrorist organizations is that most of the funds that they need them to maintain these groups in perfect, let's say, working conditions. The biggest amount of spending for them is for salaries. The second would be for travel and logistics, then for training, propaganda, recruitment, and also for corruption and social welfare. So only 10% of the funds obtained by terrorist organizations are actually used for operational purposes, for attacks. So this is some of the things that we know. What we do not know, for instance, is how much is currently in the EU being obtained for funding terrorist organizations. We do not know this, but based on the studies and on the operations that we support, we can surely say that has been a substantial increase. Looking back on the decade between 85 and 95, studies showed us an estimated $80 million had been obtained by religiously inspired terrorism organizations. From the subsequent decade, from 95 to 2005, this value escalated to $1 billion. And between 2005 and 2016, no such studies exist, but we do have an estimation on what the budgets are for the main terrorist organizations. And so we can also see this number increasing. For the Hezbollah, for instance, a budget is estimated between $250 to $500 million a year, most of it coming from state funding. For the Al-Qaeda, which is now currently, of course, in its low point, something between $20 to $50 million annually, most of it coming in from donations. And for ISIS, well, in 2015, they advertised their own budget of $2 billion for that year. Most of it, of course, coming from the resources connected with the control of territory, so the robberies from central banks, the sales of oil, the sales of natural resources. And so it is estimated that this budget currently has decreased substantially due to the loss of territory, and it's probably decreased up to 80%. Anyway, these numbers show that there's been a substantial increase in terms of their capacity to obtain funds. On the other side, on VAT frauds, well, what do we know about VAT frauds? Well, these are simply the biggest frauds that exist in the EU. By value, these are numbers that are unthinkable for most of the citizens that live in Europe. Even for us who work in areas like this, financial crime and money laundering, it's very difficult to actually have a clear idea of what this is. And this is money that it's not just being taken away from the citizens of Europe, it's being directly given to organized crime groups. So this is something that is bad in a double way. It's money that's not being invested in essential services like justice, like security, like education or health, and it's being given to organized crime groups who then, of course, use it to invest into more crime, to buy drugs that they will resell for profit, to buy tobacco that they will resell illegally, of course, to do frauds, to do corruption. It's money that they will use for this or either to invest in the legal economy, which is also not good, because this distorts the legal economy, because this means that at the end of the day, it's not the companies producing the best products at the best price that survive, but it's the companies that are being subsidized by organized crime. And so how much are we talking about exactly? 2016, the latest study that was done on this, told us that the VAT gap, meaning the difference between the VAT that we receive and the VAT that we should actually receive in 1 year, was of 160 billion euros. That year alone, the budget of the EU was 155 billion. So just this gap would be enough to pay for all of the costs of running the EU. Of course, the VAT gap is not all about VAT fraud. So the VAT fraud and the carousel fraud is a part of this. We estimate this at 60 billion euros per year. Anyway, 60 billion euros is a huge number. How much of this is being actually used for terrorism financing purposes? Well, I wish I had a number. But we do not have a number, and we believe that there are no such credible studies to achieve this number. What we do know is that, of course, terrorism financing and VAT fraud, they're very complex, they're very secretive, they're very difficult to investigate and to understand. And some people might try to see it in a simplified way that, well, okay, so VAT fraud is making billions, the terrorists need billions to exist and to survive, so there must be a connection here, and so all of this money is somehow going into terrorism financing. We believe that is not the case. We believe that is not the case. And why do we do that? We base ourselves on the work of the colleagues investigating terrorism financing and on the colleagues investigating VAT fraud. So based on the work of the colleagues on terrorism financing, we know already, because of several investigations over the recent years, what are the major sources of terrorism financing. And thinking about, of course, only in the illegal ones, because the legals, they are not of interest for this exercise, the main sources, by order of importance, would be drug trafficking, kidnapping for ransom, extortion or revolutionary taxes, depending how you would like to call it, smuggling activities, and then we have a different category where we would include frauds, all frauds, thefts, and petty crimes. So VAT fraud would be included by us in this second category in terms of funds, and it's all together with all the other frauds that terrorists commit against banks, against the social welfare, against insurance companies. And so for us, it is there, of course, but it's not that high on the table. Also, why? I told you, because of the colleagues who work in the VAT fraud investigations. So these groups have been identified. Some of the major groups, I would say the highest level type of groups, they've been around doing this for more than 10 years. And so it's normal that some of the companies will repeat itself in some of these investigations, like it was mentioned here today. We know who those groups are. They are basically Franco-Israeli groups and British-Pakistani groups. Top leadership of these groups operates from outside of the EU, so it's very hard to get, very hard to reach. And they've been doing this for a long time. They know how to do it. They continuously change the different commodity, of course, that they're using for the VAT fraud. They continuously change the companies that they use, the bank accounts that they use. Sometimes they even use the same network. They just use a different missing trader, which is actually where the countries will focus. And so instead of having the missing trader in Spain, they put it in France, they put it in Belgium, the one not paying the taxes. And so these groups have been around for a while. They've been investigated. We know that these high-level groups that we consider to be only 2% of the groups, they take about 80% of all the criminal profits. So this is where we need to focus our attention. They started in the food sector, like we heard. They went to the metal sector. Then they went to mobile phones. Then they went to electronic items, to vehicles. And then they discovered the energy sector. And they realized that it was much, much easier for them because they don't need to send any products anymore. They started by sending in the products. Some of them just, after a couple of years, they would send containers full of rocks just to justify the invoices and the payments. But once they discover the services, it's so much easier because nothing needs to be sent through borders. They just need to send the invoices and to make the payments. And this is why the carbon credit fraud that was mentioned here today was the biggest fraud of that year with an estimated value of 6 billion euros that time alone. Nowadays they have a new product. They discovered the voice over internet protocol type of communications, and they're investing and abusing the VAT on the VoIP communications. These are highly professional criminal groups. They need a very profound technical expertise and network of contacts. And so these criminal talents, they are very hard to find. And so, of course, it is possible, we would say, that some Islamic extremists might be connected to these groups, but our estimation is that their number would always be low. Also, if we think about the hierarchy of these groups, so we have the leadership, the ones who get most of the profits, who have the idea, who have the contacts, who have the knowledge, who have the initial money to make the first funding. Then we would have the ones that we would call the managers, the ones who would get all the other people to work and will coordinate them. Then we would have the mid-level, which are the persons who are in front of the companies who are being used for the VAT frauds. And then we have the lower level, people who will sell their IDs and would sign documents only to make sure that they will be used as frontmen. On the cases that we know, the connections with terrorism financing have existed only on this mid-level, so meaning the persons in front of companies, and on the lower level, meaning the persons selling documents, signing papers, usually in exchange of a one-time payment, because most of them then will become foreign fighters, so it's just about getting that much money as they can before they're leaving. And the other ones, also the ones in the mid-level, the ones who would be, let's say, leader of companies, these persons, they only receive a small percentage of the money that actually goes through that company, so not from the entire fraud ring. This only goes for the leaders and for the managers. And so we estimate that they would be receiving something in the order of something like 2 to 10%. This is what the managers of these companies are receiving. And so because of this small number of cases that we know about, and because of what we know of these structures, our idea is that only a small fraction of the VAT fraud is actually being delivered for the purposes of terrorism financing. And so to end this, is this something that we then should not be concerned about because this is a small number, a small fraction? Well, I don't think so. I think we should be worried, and it's important that we're here today. And this is for two very simple reasons, and one of them was already explained by you. One of them is that, in fact, these attacks, they're very cheap. That's why they only need to use 10% of their profits to make sure that they commit the attacks on the EU. 75%, these were the studies mentioned by you, 75% of all the attacks in EU soil costed less than 10,000 euros. One of the last attacks, for instance, the one that took place on the Thalys, we estimated to have a cost of 600 euros. Some of the attacks currently with knives and with trucks running over people, what is the cost of this? This is very small. And if we look at the prices of some of the weapons, for instance, that we know were used coming in from the former Yugoslavia, where an AK-47 costs around 400 euros, a grenade costs around 50 euros, a handgun costs around 150 euros, we can see how dangerous this is. The second reason is, of course, just a pure mathematical reason, because even a small percentage of something very big, like 60 billion, is a very, very big number. So 0.5%, for instance, of 60 billion is the equivalent of 300 million euros. And so it is something, I believe, that we should keep in mind. We came a long way since 9/11 in terms of the fight against terrorism financing, but there's still a lot, I believe, that needs to be done, because every year we see these billions of euros being taken away from the EU economy, and the fact that only a couple of thousand euros are necessary to make a large-scale attack. So the conclusion, I believe, is simple. We need to improve the systems, we need to improve the detection, because otherwise the risk is just too great. So it is a pleasure to be here today. Thank you for inviting Europol. Thank you for bringing us over to discuss this important topic, and I will be glad to respond to any questions that you might have.
Muchísimas gracias por su exposición.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And the cooperation with Europol is extremely valuable, cooperation with this particular committee. At this point, I'll give the floor to Mr. Marius Christian Frunza, I believe, Director of Schwarztal Capital. It is a financial investigation organization, company. Mr. Frunza is a specialist in international finance and provides different forms of assessment and counseling to international banks as far as the implementation of the various framework regulations concerning fighting financial crime. Of course, it's very important for banks to support the regulatory mechanisms and for the private sector as well. And of course, all of the comments that you have to make with regard to this particular ever so touchy issue are extremely important to us. Thank you very much.
Los miembros del panel, prefiero hablar en inglés.
I prefer to speak in English, says the speaker, and it continues in English now.
So, I will start talking about terrorism, but in a very different manner. I started investigating from a, let's say, more macro perspective, what's going on VAT and respectively also on organized crime since the years of the carbon markets and the fall of the carbon markets. And what really happened from, again, from a high-level perspective is that there is a big change in the way terrorism functions. And this big change happened during the years 2010. And the turning point was most likely what happened with the Patriot Act in 2003, when in all the banks and across all the financial sector you have a big scrutiny of what's going on in big transfers of money between offshore and onshore and at international level. So this entails the thing that financing terrorism across the globe, it becomes more complicated than it was 20 years ago. So like, let's say, Lockerbie or 9/11, that are things that require big fundings, a big structural funding with big transfers across many countries. Now, what really happened and what we see is that we have a new form of terrorism, which I would call it Uber terrorism, and it entails a Uberization of the way terrorist works. And by Uberization is just to keep the parallel with the new trends in a digital economy. And what do we understand by this? We understand a decentralized form of functioning, a distributed way of functioning, and also a low-cost way of functioning. By decentralization, I would say that you don't have a structure, a hierarchical structure in the way we saw it in the early years of Al-Qaeda or in Hezbollah or, let's say, in the Irish separatist army. So there are a different way of functioning. So how does it work? It works that, in fact, that this Uber terrorism is, in fact, a network. It is a terrorist network, and we can go further as a social terrorist network. So you don't have a structure, people from Sweden, Denmark, Belgium, United Kingdom, if they find interest in pursuing some action, violent or non-violent. They're going to associate and they're going to deploy it without being even sanctioned by a higher hierarchy. So that's the first thing. The thing is, how does the financing work? So how do you finance this thing? So the big change in Uber terrorism is that you don't need any more centralized way. You don't have people from the Gulf, the big families sending money in Europe or the United States. It's slightly different, is that people have financing where the attack goes or in the nearbys of where the attacks or the terror act are happening. And also, Uber terrorism chooses to work on low-cost forms of terror. So we move from a high-cost operating way, like we saw in 9/11, to low-cost operations, like the Paris attacks from Bataclan were figured around 50K. So that's a big thing. And also, we go from high severity to low severity but high media impact. Now, the last thing is, how do you finance those kind of things in the country where you are doing it? And you have various ways. You have tax fraud, benefit fraud, application fraud with banks, cryptocurrency mining, there's as big things, sanction breaching, and all other stuff. So if we go like a benchmark, old versus new, we have all kind of transitions. So let's take an organization which is classic terrorism. I put there an example of the Breton Revolutionary Army, a new way of organizing the Uber terrorist ISIS, which employs the new way. It's funny, somebody I think is laughing, but it's very interesting. But if you are born today in Brittany, in France, it's most likely going to join ISIS than the Breton Revolutionary Army. That's a real change. And the big change also that it is noticed is that if previously in the classic way terrorists were looking to do organized crime, were involved in narcotics, human trafficking, weapon trafficking, now what's the tendency is a little bit reversed. There is organized crimes looking to get in touch with terrorists. And it's for a very simple fact. The law enforcement cut a lot of the traditional avenues of organized crime. So criminals which are not in any way or mode linked from, let's say, ideological perspective with terrorists, they want to get in touch with terrorists. They want to go around those areas, around Iraq and Syria, where you have a little bit of safe harbors. So you have less presence of tax authorities, law enforcement, and other stuff. So that's also a big change. Now, let's go to the main topic of this hearing, which is the VAT. So a couple of years ago, I did a study for the European Parliament concerning the cost of non-Europe, and amongst the things that were blocking the European integration is the VAT gap. So reducing the VAT gap, it will provide a better integration. What does VAT mean today? VAT in the European Union is around 16 to 18% of all taxes collected in the 28th member countries. That includes Great Britain. And obviously the number increased, but it's a structural funding at the national budgets. Now, when you talk about this, there is the gap, and the gap it's obviously figured in 100 billions. And the main question is, why VAT? VAT is very simple. Why VAT is chosen? Because VAT is simple to implement, can be leveraged very easily. In these social networks of terrorism, people are communicating, are sharing the ideas, and it's very easy to replicate something that we saw in Denmark, can be replicated in Spain, can be transferred to another underlying, etc., etc. So, we can have this, and the main question is how much can be what we would expect to see as a number. Before was one of the questions of the panel. So if we rescale what we saw in Sweden, Belgium, and Denmark, where are the main cases of VAT fraud, if we try to remodel and to rescale at European level, we have a figure of around 42 million euros. And this will not include the billion, the famous billion with the famous papers from from Afghanistan, which in this model works as the classical way of funding. So we have big frauds with big transfers. So 42 million fund the new way of operations, so the Uber terrorists. Now, again, a few of the features. So a lot of the people involved in this tax evasion are of North African, Asian, Middle Eastern descent, where trade is kind of a tradition. So they have like trading, opening businesses, opening shop. It's something in their business. It's something cultural. So it's very easy going, a very easy way to take this avenue. Also, it is important, as terrorist needs recruitment, also VAT needs new recruitment. So once you open a company, you've been a missing trader, you are labeled as a director who cannot take any more action. So you need always new blood, new people that will be the frontmans. So recruitment is a key thing. So additionally, how it works, how we leverage, there are what you can call boot camps, where people join together. There are transfer of knowledges, transfer of ideas from one market to another, from one country to another. More or less, a lot of the terrorism, most of the terrorism today is religious. In some countries, in Islam, and an extremist form of Islam like Wahhab and the Salafism, some of the taxes imposed by governments, like the VAT, are not sanctioned by some extremist religious leader, which they say the religious tax should be paid before are the main thing, and what you pay the government, it's not crucial. So we can have, the zakat becomes a form, has upper hand on the VAT. Last but not least is the relationship with transnational organized crime. So there is a kind of a merge between an avenue of uniting the intersection between VAT fraudsters, terrorists, and the organized crime. Organized crime is looking for new harbors, from new way of avoiding the attention for the police and law enforcement, and this area of terrorism is one of the places that provides a safe haven. What can be done? So I think there is a real need for a paradigm shift in the way terrorism, organized crime, and financing is currently investing. Currently, there are a lot of silos. This picture, this big puzzle, because it is a big puzzle with very small pieces. This big puzzle is taking care of a lot of different agencies, and I think what is really needed is to share all the information that you have in intelligence agencies, both private and public, financial intelligence units in banks, law enforcement, obviously, and custom and tax officers that work for investigating VAT. That's a crucial thing, because you cannot investigate VAT on one side, organized crime on one side, and terrorists. So there needs to be a kind of a cross-disciplinary approach. Last but not the least is the thing that Uber-terrorism is a global threat, and it's a global threat for everybody. So there are always political tensions, but if you take an organization like ISIS, the management, operational management on the territories, they are, for instance, most of them are Russian-speaking. The low-ranking soldiers come from North Africa or from other places, people who are in charge of financing and funding funds or logistics come from Europe. So, in fact, the idea is that for tackling this phenomena, it is important that agencies from various regions, and mainly United Kingdom, European Union, US, and Russian Federation, they are able to share in an effective way information. And this is where I stop my presentation. Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Extremely interesting and very, very useful as well as far as our recommendations are concerned. And I welcome and I give the floor now to Mr. Jezik, who is the chair of the Tax 3 committee, and at this point he will assume the chair here in this particular hearing. Thank you.
Well, we will open the discussion. As always, the questions will be asked in slots of 5 minutes, a question of 1 minute maximum, the remaining time devoted for the answer. If there is remaining time or within the time frame, a follow-up question can be asked. So we will start with rapporteurs. I can see Tax 3 rapporteurs. So it will be Ludek Niedermayer, EPP. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for participating in this joint meeting. I guess it was an excellent idea. You are talking about the costs and the problems that we are having. We are focusing on the way how to eliminate them, and this will be exactly my question. I don't know if any one of you want to comment on proposed VAT reform and to which extent it would help, because I guess this would be rather part of our second hearing today. But if anyone wants to say if they believe it will work, I will appreciate. But my question basically concentrates at two other important tools that are just in the process of implementing. The first is the beneficial ownership registries that should give better access to information who is who, and the second, almost global exchange of information on the bank accounts. So I wonder to which extent you think this will help. The second question is that in past, cash transactions were very closely related to financing of crime. But in 21st century, with Uber terrorists and all this stuff, I wonder to which extent the cash transactions still play important role and are important risk factor. Thank you.
Yes. Who would like to take the first question? Is there anyone? Yes, Mr. Seixas-Feliz.
Well, thank you. About the reform of the VAT system, I would just remind that the current system that was created, when it was created, was supposed to be a temporary system. So it's been in place already for a time that I believe it's more than that was expected. And so we welcome these reforms. We are very expecting to see them come into force, and then of course we will see if they work better. I'm sure they will work better because we have learned with the mistakes of this current system, and so we would like to see it come into force as soon as possible. It's just what I would like to say. Regarding the beneficial owner registration, it is also a very important step, but once again we have to see how it will work in practice, because of course the criminals, the real criminals, the ones who will use these companies and who will use these bank accounts, they will still use the front man and the straw man, who would still sign as being the beneficial owners of the companies, and so they will continue to evade us and to lie to us, and so we need to make sure that this has strong penalties and that the ones on the front line, meaning the banks, they will ask the right questions to try to really understand who the real beneficial owner is and not just the one who's going in and signing the papers. So we have to give it, once again, time to see how it works. Global information on bank accounts. Well, I wish this would be a reality. We still face the problems of offshores and tax havens who are used on all of these massive frauds and all of these massive scandals. And for those who have the knowledge and who have the means, they will still continue to use them, and so they will continue to evade the surveillance of the EU and of the law enforcement community in Europe that simply cannot have access to this type of information. Or when it has, it's been 6 or 8 months, and so the money already is not there anymore, just went around to another tax haven, who then we need to ask and wait for another 6 months, and then it's in another, and so this is, the timelines of this is impossible with judicial investigations. Cash transactions, a risk factor, of course. Of course, cash is still king for money laundering and for terrorism financing purposes. The easiest way to transfer money, to move money, and to make sure that it's being done in an anonymous way, it's still about cash. It's still using cash. We still see loads of bags of cash, suitcases full of cash. We have this issue with the 500 euro note, which is high value and low volume. So in one of these easy carry-on luggages, we can take up to 4 or 5 million euros just in one bag. And so it's something that we constantly see being seized in airports, in the borders of the EU. It's hidden inside everything that you can imagine, the bags, inside of candies, inside of computers, inside of cookie bars, inside of food. And so it is one of the ways that it's still being used, mostly I would say by organized crime, but also probably by terrorism financers.
Thank you very much. Would anyone, very briefly, please, we have Mr. Elton.
Thank you. I'd just like to add 2 things about the cash. The main character in the Spanish network that I was describing before, the Danish citizen, who is now arrested in Spain as the leader of this group, he was arrested at one time carrying 100,000 euro in cash while traveling to Spain. So yes, cash is of course an issue. And the other things about the beneficiary ownership networks, I was investigating a company that was set up with a Danish Syrian foreign fighter as director, and all the paperwork was pointing back to him. And it was just by coincidence that one of the payment checks for the rent of the shop that has been set up in his name was linked to a bank account owned by a person we now know is central in this fraud. It was the only link to him was just one simple transfer of 1 month's rent. So the beneficial network, beneficial ownership databases will be helpful, but certainly not give full disclosure.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Eck, did you want? Yeah, briefly, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I would like to respond in my mother tongue, mother language, because due to the technical level of discussion. Thank you very much. La prima întrebare, registrele.
Well, the first question on the subject of the register of beneficial owners. Well, of course, we would need to have faster, more complete connections between the different registers that exist. Given the level of financial crime and the means of financing terrorism, it goes beyond the borders of all member states. The results of investigations could actually be endangered. So we need to ensure that each member state should have a full application of the fourth directive that would really apply this register. Now, many countries are not in that situation yet. We are still waiting for that register to be set up. We have been waiting for a long time. And we're certainly hoping that from this autumn, from 2018, we should have the possibility to have access to these registers so that we can get the information that we need. As for global information exchange, we shouldn't forget that there are different systems and different procedures in each single member state. Prosecutors haven't got the same kinds of tools that FIUs have got, so it would be good to have more harmonization of the different tools we can use.
Well, we shouldn't ask too many questions to too many guest speakers, otherwise we will simply don't make it within the time frame. Jeppe Kofod, co-rapporteur, SND, please.
Well, thank you so much, Chair, and also thank you so much to our panel. Very interesting. 2 questions. I'll be brief. First of all, I would ask a question to my Danish fellow Dane, Bo Elkjær. In the written answer, you write that the cooperation between tax authorities, financial police, the regular police, intelligence service is hampered by bureaucracy. And now I understand in Denmark there's an interdepartmental group set up to sort out that kind of things. Can you give some practical examples on how you identified this bureaucracy that lead to inefficiency? And maybe the same to Europol in a sense. I mean, we have the discussion now, if I use Europol, national police, what type of platform could we set up or strengthen? We have something in Europol, I know, but strengthen in order to exchange information and access information very easily on a European level, because many of these cases we see are already, it's in several constituencies in several countries, so we need, in a way, a platform as well that is efficient and non-bureaucratic. So these 2 questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Mr. Elkjær, please.
Well, the case that I was describing with this Spanish-Danish network, the VAT fraud started in 2011. That's an important time point to have. The group of Danish jihadists that traveled to Malia and radicalized this cell was being monitored by Danish intelligence services from 2006. And they traveled to Spain in 2008. The fraud started in 2011. In 2014, the Spanish authorities reached out to the Danish authorities to get information on these people. The first awareness of the fraud outside of the intelligence services in Denmark was from the financial police, the Special Særlig Økonomisk og International Kriminalitet. Sorry about that one. Danish is a horrible language. They were aware of the fraud from June 2013. And this is the police that investigates this kind of fraud. They had information on one of the essential companies in January 2014. The Spanish group was arrested in May 2014. The Guardia Civil reached out to the Danish authorities in June 2014. And in February 2015, they were told to send a formal request for information. And in March 2015, SOIC, the economic police, reached out and informed the intelligence services about this fraud. But at that time, they didn't know that the police intelligence had been aware of this group since 2006. And in 2015, later in 2015, the group was reported to the police by the Danish tax authorities, who wanted the police to start an investigation of this fraud. And the regular police reached out to the intelligence services asking for information on this group, but never received any information from them. This is just an example of how this bureaucracy has been hampering this investigation, which could have been stopped had the police intelligence services shared their information way earlier in this process. The fraud itself reached until something like 2016, when this network of Spanish-Danish companies were dissolved, and some of the leading characters, the guy I talked about before with the €100,000 in cash while traveling, he was arrested last year in Spain. So this is just an example of how the bureaucracy has been stopping down this investigation.
Thank you, Mr. Seix.
Bureaucracy, silos, lack of cooperation. Yeah, I think these are indeed areas that we need to focus because these are areas of improvement. Starting with the first one, the FIUs in Europol. Indeed, we do have a project, as you are aware. We have already since some time did what we call the FIU net embedment. So the FIU net was a network connecting the FIUs of the 28 member states. They had their own network. They worked within themselves. And so we started this project of embedding this network, so bringing it to inside Europol, so that, of course, at the higher level of Europol, we could finally make what we call this diagonal cross-checks. So cross-checks between information that is coming in from the FIUs of one member state and that is, for instance, in the police of another member state, because this information would never be cross-checked and this hit would never be discovered. So we started that. But to be honest, we are still a long way from having this vision, so where we can actually have the information that all of the 28 FIUs had retrieved. That was international, of course, because we have no interest in national information, and to be able to cross-check with information coming in from the police of the 28 member states, because this would be really important. It would allow us to detect many cases, not only of VAT fraud, but of economic and financial crime at a much earlier stage. But this has been a difficult process. There's a lot of difficulties, technical difficulties, political difficulties also. So we need to invest more into having something like this in Europol, to making sure that all the information that we have scattered currently in all these different services can actually be put to use, be centralized and be analyzed in a single place. Regarding VAT fraud, well, police and tax services, they need to work together. So the current system that we have is not one of the best. Because of the rules of tax secrecy, what happens is that police can only be informed of a lot of the suspicions that going around on the major VAT fraudsters only at the very late stage. So only after it's been already, sometimes for years, in the tax services, investigating, oh yes, now we think there are grounds for a criminal suspicion. And only then can police be informed. And of course, only then can Europol be informed. And so this needs to change. We have good examples in some of the member states. They call them the COBRA teams. So joint teams of police and tax services where there is no such thing as a tax secrecy. And so one of the things that we advocate is the existence in each of the member states of specialized units for investigation, for preventing VAT fraud. That would include police and tax services. And of course, I believe that we would also need special prosecutors and judges, because these areas are very technical. They're very difficult to be handled by someone who is not an expert.
Yes, Mrs. Huck, please.
Thank you. Legat de birocratizarea căilor.
On the subject of bureaucracy, and the way that it endangers cooperation and the exchange of information between magistrates. We have a system that works, EFU-net. It's a proactive system, and financial information is put in that system and circulates very quickly. And this is vital information for investigations. And this important information can go very quickly to prosecutors and also to the police. It's a very rapid network. It works much quicker than letters rogatory or international requests. The system is much quicker, and it is well known that letters rogatory and requests for mutual assistance are much slower because of the procedure involved. And this is a system which runs separately from the magistrates. And if we can get the information quickly through EFU-net, we get the information quickly, but it doesn't have the same value as evidence, and that is why we have to get the evidence through the letters of rogatory or the other methods for requests for mutual assistance. So EFU-net does work, but as I say, you can't use the information that you get that way as evidence. As part of a procedure, there is no judge who would be able to use that information as evidence. And so for that reason, we do need to use the other mechanisms that we have. As I say, letters rogatory and requests for mutual assistance. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me ask you one thing, any of you, if you would like to answer. Considering the incredible amount, as Mr. Sessions-Felicio said, it's something like as much as almost the VAT fraud, as much as the EU budget that is we are handing to the criminals and the terrorists. Why haven't European governments passed the proposed reform of VAT by the Commission, which has been there for more than a year? Why are some European governments resisting? Could you consider that there could be indeed capture of some European governments or people in governments that actually prevent that? Because, of course, if we are dealing with so powerful and so rich criminal networks, anything is possible. How to explain this resistance of member states to indeed close that gap that enables the criminals, including the terrorists? The governments that make all this security-driven rhetoric and then do not act on closing a gap that could be really crucial. Then my question is about cash. As you highlighted, Mr. Sessions-Felicio, it's still the very important element. And what is the progress? I mean, the 500 euro bill was supposed to be prohibited, but we know that some member states still have much more and still print much more cash than other member states combined. For instance, I directed a question to the Prime Minister of Luxembourg when he came here on that particular case. It's the case of Luxembourg, but it's not the only case, of course. So how is it functioning? And then could you elaborate more on the role of cryptocurrencies? Mr. Frunze, you talked about cryptocurrencies. We are seeing several members of our member states who happen to be offshores, for instance, Malta, but not only Malta, actually going into the cryptocurrency and styling themselves as hubs for cryptocurrency businesses. So what does this mean? Thank you.
Any volunteer for the first question? No one wants to speculate on this. Don't have much time, so we can go to the second one then, if there is no volunteer on the first one. So on the cash, Mr. Frunze? Okay.
Yeah, on the crypto. So
yeah, well, we will come to crypto, but I thought that the second question...
It was specifically addressed to crypto. I'll not answer questions which are specifically addressed to me.
Yeah.
The crypto. Okay. So, as you know, cryptocurrencies is a subclass, what's a bigger class, which is called the digital currencies. And the digital currencies are around the 90s. And in the early 90s, except PayPal, every other platform was shut down for money laundering. So, you know, crypto, I think a lot of people talk about crypto, but they don't know really what it is. We have 1,500 cryptocurrencies right now going around the world. So we have 249 nations, but less than 249 currencies. In Europe, for instance, we have only 4 or 5 currencies, but we have 1,500 currencies. So one might think, why do we need so many currencies? What people do is so many cryptos. So the allegation of having criminals doing this is for sure, this is not the case of debating around it. Now, why terrorists were going to go there is because with what we call the mining process, where you can generate profits from being joined into this cryptocurrency system, you can generate profits. You know, everybody can generate money, and also if as a physical person, you don't need to be registered as a company in Europe to mine cryptocurrencies. Maybe the only exception is Malta, and maybe the Baltic countries, but in the other, you can do it on your own computer. And let's say if somebody asks where the money comes from, where do you have this proceeds? Mining crypto, it's giving, say, okay, I'm mining Monero, or I'm mining Bitcoin, etc., etc. And also, this is the first thing, it's the source of revenue. Second thing is, you can move money, particularly everywhere in the world, without being any outside of the banking system. And it's not controlled. And the cost of going from crypto to cash, by cash I'm meaning notes, etc., is around 9%, was 9% in 2014. But right now, a lot of people accept for services crypto. So I'm giving you the, you can do the add up and to see exactly what really means.
Thank you. We will go from crypto to cash as well, or on crypto still, or?
Maybe on crypto I can say some things.
Okay, yeah.
So things change very fast. So if this was in 2014 when I joined Europol, I would say that this would be just an invention, that there would be nothing on cryptocurrencies. But the fact is, things change fast and people evolve, terrorists too, of course. And so there have been a couple of cases of crowdfunding platforms over the internet that have been detected being as associated with Islamic extremists, where they require the funds to be sent via cryptocurrencies. So 1 or 2 cases, 3 or 4 maybe. There is no absolute certainty that this was not a fraud and that this money was not being taken to be used for different purposes. But the fact is, they were advertising it, and there are some indications that some of these funds might have been obtained through this. In other cases of some hidden forums over the internet, it was detected that terrorists between themselves, they would give sorts of training or manuals on how to use them, how to buy them, how to sell them, what are the advantages. And so they do have some kind of interest in this, and they are getting the knowledge. It is starting only, so we don't see this as a current big threat, but they are starting and they are dedicating some time into this. We also know, because as it was mentioned, it's very easy to transport them over borders. I mean, they're just in your phone, in your laptop. You just go anywhere in the world and you can buy them and sell them, basically, if you have a connection to the internet. So that some of the foreign fighters, they also use this means to transport money from Europe to the regions of conflict when they were going to those regions. So this is a very small thing, but it's something we need to keep a very close look, because it was also, for instance, something new in terms of organized crime. We saw that, of course, all the criminals over the dark net selling drugs and so on, they were already using this for years. And we would never see this as going mainstream, let's say for the Colombian cartels, for instance. But we detected that last year. So for the first time last year, we detected a couple of cases where some of the major Colombian cartels are extensively using cryptocurrencies to make sure that they balance, meaning that they are able to take away the value that they have in Europe from the sales of drugs directly to Colombia and to other countries in South America. So they have lost the fear for these new technologies. They're having the knowledge. And it was very fast. And from one year to the other, we saw a huge increase. And so this can happen also in the area of terrorism.
That's interesting. And the second question on the cash, who would like to? Would you like to? Yeah.
I don't want to talk too much, but cash is one of my favorite topics. So, unfortunately, I would say that little have changed since the decision by the ECB. Of course, the decision was to end the production of the 500 euro note by the end of this year, and so they will uphold to this decision as far as we know. But the thing is, this note will continue as legal tender for at least another 20 years. And so this has changed nothing in terms of practice. We saw that in some cases, for instance, some criminals, because I think they understood wrongly the message, they were trying to get rid of these notes. And so they went massively to banks to exchange these notes. And so it was a good opportunity. We managed to identify some of them. Others who realize the message are doing the opposite, so they're buying them and they're paying over their face value, up to 15% more than the face value of one of these notes, because they know it's still a good investment for them, because they can stash them, they can transport them, and it's very easy because it's low value and, high value and low volume. So little has changed. It's still the main way for criminals to transport funds all over Europe and the world.
Thank you very much. Alde, Caroline Nachtigall.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I have a few questions related to my work, also on cybercrime and the third country aspects. And first of all, to start with a question for Europol. How did the priorities and also the investigation tools, well, let's say, change in the last years to face the development of cybercrimes and new virtual money? The laundering techniques. And maybe related to that question, do you feel that the new steps that are taken by the European Commission, for example, the revision of the anti-money laundering directive and also the new proposal on the VAT, are going into the right direction? And maybe a last short question, and that's more in general, is the bilateral agreement that we have with Norway that just approved, that was, I guess it was in February this year by the Council. Is that going to be useful in reducing the VAT fraud? And could this be also an approach that could be used with other third countries? And if you say yes, then of course is my question, which country should we focus on? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Seixas, Europol.
Well, thank you for the question. I believe that Europol did a lot in terms of facing this cybercrime threat, and specifically also in the field of virtual currencies. And so we have established the Cybercrime Center at Europol, so it's a center on its own. It has a staffing that is quite considerable, so the centers would have around 142 to 80 staff each. So I think they are within the upper class of this staffing. Of course, if they could have more, that would be also positive for them for sure. And so one of their main tasks within the Cybercrime Center was to devote study and attention to the virtual currencies world. They have hired some of the best experts from the law enforcement within Europe, and they have provided training for me, for my team, which I consider as very valuable. Of course, they go to the member states, they try to explain what's going on in terms of the trends, and they have prepared a set of manuals who are, I would say, the reference, not only for Europe, but for the law enforcement all over the world, in terms of how to investigate virtual currencies, what can be done, what are the contacts. We are constantly in contact with the private sector, of course, which is very important in an area of economic and financial crime, and also in this area of virtual currencies. And so I believe that, at least at the Europol level, we are prepared. Are the member states prepared? That is something that will take a little bit more time, but we are trying to make sure that we all can be prepared for this, because it is coming. We just don't know exactly when. The proposals and the changes within the directive, they were very welcomed, of course, because we considered, as you did, that, of course, the exchanges of virtual currencies should be obliged entities. They operate as banking entities. They are the ones in the front line of this new field, in contact with the clients, with the customers. And so they have this responsibility to identify them, to make sure they know who they are, and, of course, to report any kind of suspicious transactions, just like a normal bank. So we welcome this very much. This will give us access to new sources of information that are fundamental when we need to associate, because everything is public on the blockchain, of course, but then we just have a number, which is an address, and when we need to know the person behind the number, we need to have the information from these private entities. Agreement with Norway, yes, I believe so. I believe it will bring us an extended cooperation, because this allows us then to exchange not only the strategic type of data, but the personal data. This allows us to be in direct contact, to invite them for operational meetings. Would we need this with other third countries? Well, yes, of course, but this is no longer in the hands of Europol since the new regulation came about, so this has to be decided here, and I'm not the person more qualified to discuss this topic, I'm sorry.
Thank you very much. Or would anyone like to comment? Yes, Mrs. Hack.
În ceea ce privește criptomonedele.
Well, when we're talking about virtual currencies, well, if you'll allow me, I think that there's another alarm we should take into account. Platforms or virtual currencies where money is exchanged. I think that that is, in some ways, is the dream of every human being when we're talking about the idea of getting rich quick. Well, everybody would love to get rich from one day to the next. But for us as investigators, these platforms represent a big headache. If you have to investigate, you have huge trouble dealing with these, because it's very hard to find out the identity of who's involved in the transaction, who is buying, who is selling. So I am convinced that all investigators in Europe would be very keen on the 5th directive, which would allow us to get some control over the transactions carried out through virtual platforms. In the Romanian system, our national bank has always sounded the alarm bells on this. We have always said this is not normal. Virtual currencies cannot be accepted as a means of payment. But that is just a national policy. It certainly should not become a problem for those who are trying to sell their products legally on the internet, however.
Next, ENF Mario Borghesio.
Grazie, Presidente.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. And I'd also like to thank the people who've spoken. Now, I think that there's a very important fact that has been identified, and that is the use of VAT fraud and general tax fraud for financing terrorism. And do you think that this is because of the lack of signals coming from the banking system? Are there a lack of alerts from the banking system? And what needs to be done to get better respect for these responsibilities? For example, in the struggle against organised crime, that's something that I've always insisted upon, and their magistrates have been working very hard on organised crime. Do you think there's anything that we could learn there? And what about facilitation of the first country of import when the goods are to be exported to another country? Do you think that this rule is something that helps with VAT fraud? Well, helps the fraudsters. And I was very interested by the investigations in Denmark and other countries. There is one aspect that has regard to Italy. These investigations quite often start off with the discovery of VAT fraud, but then when you trace this back, then you find the links to terrorism and jihadists. So what about the idea of having investigations that follow these people that move from the Middle East to Europe to pray in mosques. Could we carry out the investigations the other way around?
The first question on the banking system, Mrs. Huck.
La prima întrebare legată de...
Well, to answer that first question on monitoring, which is quite difficult in the financial system, we all know that financial information, if there are links with terrorism, has to come from the financial system. But the financial system it has quite rigid surveillance, because if something is detected, it should be reported right away rather than 3 years later, because if I as a public prosecutor get information 3 years later, it's not very helpful to me. I can't use that information, and so I'm speaking on my own behalf, not on behalf of anyone else. But I think that if we could have information more quickly, I think the banks should be forced to report problematic transactions more quickly in all member states. And I think we should also be saying the following. We should be saying that if there are to be sanctions, it needs to be a completely independent person or authority. As I say, I'm speaking in a personal capacity, but I do not think that we can have sanctions on banks if it's going to be decided by some sort of a board that's in a centralized authority. That, as I say, is my personal opinion, but I am convinced that an inspector, a bank inspector who is independent and who can carry out independent evaluations could justify why a bank that hasn't reported a suspicious transaction should be sanctioned. I think we can't just say that we have a board that makes decisions on the basis of certain criteria.
Thank you. On the second question, is there anyone who would like to reflect? Not really? Okay, yeah, thank you, Mr. Elby.
When I started out with investigating VAT fraud through the Danish carbon registry, I was working with a colleague. I was at the newspaper Ekstrabladet at the time, and what we found out was that this was a bulk registry of people who were involved in different illicit transactions in the system. There was only a very few amount of these accounts that were legitimate. As I said, it was reduced from 1,256 accounts to 36 accounts. So the largest bulk of it was in it for the fund money. When we looked into these groups, we found the Franco-Israeli groups that you mentioned. We also found the UK Pakistani groups. We found the Italian mafia. We found Eastern European crime gangs. We found networks out of Hong Kong and China. We found biker gangs, and besides that, all sorts of enthusiastic do-it-yourselfers. So I don't think you cannot isolate this sort of criminal activity to one particular group. It is a transnational, trans-religious, and trans-political enterprise.
Thank you. It looks like a fair representation of all regions. And okay. Well, and now there's time for Catch the Eye. I have 3 speakers on the list, which is about the number we will have to conclude with. And first, SND Caterina Cinici.
Sì, grazie. Io desidero ringraziare.
Yes, thank you very much. I'd like to thank our guests for some very interesting presentations. I think you've given us a very good overview of the problem of terrorist financing through tax fraud and links to organized crime. Well, a lot of questions have already been asked, but I wanted to come back to one important subject. Now, I'm interested in what is the scale of the the links between criminal organizations and terrorist organizations. I mean, the illicit activities, the link between traditional crime organizations and terrorist organizations. Because there is transnational organized crime that is contributing to terrorism. But do we need to improve legislation? I think some steps forward have been made. And then what about the FIUs and the links that join these together? How can we intensify the exchange of information? And I also wanted to ask our guests what their feelings are on the proposed directive that the Commission has presented on the 17th of April, which was to facilitate the use of financial information or other forms of information for preventing and prosecuting certain forms of crime. So I think that this directive could contain some very useful tools for combating terrorist financing, and particularly it would incentivize cooperation, exchange of information between FIUs and police forces too. Thank you.
Thank you. On the first question, the traditional forms of crimes and terrorism. Yes, please, Mr. Seixas.
Well, indeed, we have noticed also a few changes in this. So historically, it was usually said that there was a huge separation between organized crime and terrorism, because, of course, one was about making money, the other was about changing the political establishment. One wanted publicity, the others wanted to lay low and to continue to work in the underworld. And this has changed slightly, especially with the phenomenon, I think, of foreign fighters. So we see that a lot of these have already a previous history in terms of connection with crime, sometimes petty crime, sometimes organized crime. But the biggest links, I would say, that we see between terrorism organizations and organized crime are precisely the ones that we are discussing here today, is the economical and the financial world. Because in this world, everything is connected. So the funds, they don't care if it's a terrorist organization or if it's an organized crime group. The illegal economy, the black economy, connects these two areas very clearly. And so when we focus on investigating financial and economic crime, we end up detecting organized crime groups, like it was mentioned, and we also end up detecting terrorist organizations. So terrorist organizations, they will work in Europe to launder the profits of drug trafficking, large-scale drug trafficking. They will make sure that they will collect these profits. They will launder them throughout various jurisdictions. They will send them back to Central America because they will keep a percentage. So we have seen this. And so there is no distinction, clear at least distinction between organized crime and terrorism organizations when we look at the financial and economic world. It's all a black economy, and these actors, they move freely because they both need the money. The terrorist organizations to survive, and the organized crime, of course, because it's their objective.
Would you like on the first still? Second, FIUs, yeah, Mrs. Hake, please.
Thank you. Ca procuror pot să spun că
as a prosecutor, I can say that the financial information that we get from the FIUs is information which is extremely important. It is well known that the financial system is reluctant to provide this information directly to the authorities responsible for application of the law, and that is why these FIUs are so important, because as a prosecutor I'm very happy to work with these units. The information that we get from them is very useful to our investigations, and it is, if we as investigators can use this information that's provided to us, we're really happy about that. But that's a real success story. And I would like to just stress the fact that the financial investigation units are structured differently. Some of them are administrative, some of them are on a hybrid model. Some of them are part of law enforcement. In Romania, for instance, it is an administrative unit. We would like to have a unit which is more hybrid in nature, because we as prosecutors need to get information from financial analysts. It is important for us to know that some of the FIUs only come along with strategies. And as a prosecutor, what I would like to see is that all of the FIUs carrying out the investigations are able to use these methods and provide the analysis in good time to prosecutors.
The draft directive, oh no, still on, yeah, Mr. Seix.
On the FIU still, I believe also that there's still a long road that we need to do. So we started with this FIU net embedment in Europol, but we need to evolve this to something better and more effective, I believe. We need to have the resources and the staff to do so, but the idea of Europol is to embed the establishment of what we call EU FIU. So an area where we could have not only the capacity of having all this information coming in from the FIUs and cross-checking with the data coming in from police, where we could actually have other tools as we have been advertising. For instance, the European Terrorist Finance Tracking System, so a similar system as the TFTP agreement that we have with the US, but to operate within the area of the EU. And within this framework of this EU FIU, we could also establish this public and private partnership with some of the major banks within Europe to make sure that we could exchange intelligence in a more trustworthy environment. So this kind of copy of this GIMLIT initiative that is currently taking in the UK. So for this, of course, we would need resources and staff, but I believe that this is the way to make it more operational, to make sure it would exchange more operational data, more fast, more effective, and with all these new techniques.
Yeah, we couldn't agree more here in the Parliament. In our previous committee on Panama Papers, in the final report, we called upon member states to reinforce FIUs in the terms of financial resources, personnel, and also we called for a certain degree of harmonization throughout within the EU. Well, on the third question, on the draft directive on using financial information to fight certain forms of crime, is there any comment? No, not really. Okay. So then Ana Gomes, is anything?
The bearer shares, abolishing bearer shares. Maybe Mr. Seixas Felício could speak whether that, which was decided, for instance, by the government of Portugal, is having any impact. I know it could have an impact in countries, for instance, like Romania. I'd like to ask Ms. Ash, what do you think about the fifth anti-money laundering directive, where we have managed to insert the beneficial, the need for register for beneficial owners for companies in the EU. Unfortunately, not those from outside the EU who do business with the EU, because Council refused. But still, would you think this will be helpful?
Yes, Mr. Seixas, then Mrs. Haag.
Well, the bearer shares have been historically one of the methods used, of course, by criminals to hide the ownership of companies. We've seen so many during the Panama Papers scandal. We received so many data, and so it's actually, I thought we would be better by now, because there's been this international movement to ban bearer shares from most of the countries. But unfortunately, what we noticed during the Panama Papers scandal is that many countries still accept them. And this is, of course, an easy way for criminals to hide. So what is the purpose of having a beneficial registration if then people can just sell these companies based on the possession of a piece of paper and their name is not registered anywhere? So this is just, we are closing the door and we have the window open. So we need to push that this can no longer happen. At least in the EU, I would like to see this happen, of course, all over the world, especially in the areas of these offshores and tax havens, which I insist is one of the biggest loopholes that we have within the current financial investigations that we conduct. But I understand it's not possible, but at least if we can do this and we can make sure that we end the possibility of having this type of shares, this would be something very positive.
Thank you for the question. Trebuie să manifest așa cum manifest întotdeauna.
Thank you very much. Well, as I've already said, we always have to be very honest as magistrates. Even if today I'm here representing Romania, don't forget that I am a magistrate primarily. Now, Romania is not the top of the class in the whole system. Well, I want to be honest and I want to be open. Romania still has not implemented the fourth directive. As prosecutors, without these national registers of beneficial owners, then that is a major problem. Well, if we're bottom of the class, though, the only thing we could say is, well, we are pleased that we have the fifth directive coming our way, but we still need to start implementing the fourth directive. As a prosecutor, I'm convinced that the fifth directive can provide us with real benefits for our work. But first of all, Romania needs to properly implement the fourth directive, and it needs to be in a position only then to implement the fifth.
Gill is the last speaker.
Thank you, Chair. And my apologies that I missed the presentations earlier. I was actually voting in another committee. And so I hope I'm not repeating something that's already been covered. But I think, carousel VAT fraud is still a major problem in many countries. And I know especially in the UK. And what I would like to know, if it's not a repetition, is that to what extent, which are the countries that have really got a right model to address it and have been able to stop it? And I would say that my second point is that whilst there's a lot of focus on bigger companies and the banks are able to focus on payments and so on, suspect payments, but I think there's another area where I don't know if any work has been done on, which is nationals who are overseas citizens but living within the EU. And I know certainly in the UK this is the case, that they have residing rights there, but every time they leave, they're able to exploit the VAT system. I don't know if there's any mechanism that has been put into place that addresses that kind of abuse, that they come and go and do that. And my third point is really around how you feel the new technologies, blockchain and AI, could be used in terms of tackling fraud. And has there been much work done on this, especially in terms of addressing terrorist finance? And do you think that the sanctions imposed to the financial institutions, are these a deterrent? Are they enough? Thanks.
Thank you. The first two questions we will discuss also in the second panel. We've talked already about virtual currencies or cryptocurrencies, but can anyone try to answer or repeat in a more general sense what it's called? Cryptocurrencies. Yeah, Mr. Fronza, please.
Sorry. So the question was the use of blockchain and artificial intelligence. So currently, Dubai launched VAT this year, and they said they're going to use blockchain as technology for facilitating the control and the payment of VAT. So I think in an ideal world, when you have digital products, blockchain can be a solution. That's without any doubt, because you can track the ownership and all the supply chain of the product. So when you have a digital product, so immaterial, but when you have a container full with mobile phones, it's a little bit more complicated. So everything, when you move into the physical, when you move into the perishable goods like food or beverages, it becomes more complicated. From a theoretical point of view, it is a point blockchain can be used, but there are some natural limits to it. First thing. Now, second thing, artificial intelligence. So artificial intelligence, you can, obviously it's already used currently. So the United Kingdom, the HMRC has a big division of big data and machine learning for investigating all kind of tax evasion. So it's something, at least to answer the question, it's something at least that's going on in Great Britain and I think in other countries of the European Union. So the thing is, you will never have the artificial intelligence will give you some trends, will give you some image, but you'll very difficultly give you the precise, or give you this person is doing that. You'll not get all the answers to everything. So some people are in the banking industry, they are selling very big the thing that data mining and artificial intelligence can solve financial crime. My personal opinion is wrong. I think field work and field investigation is more necessary today than previously in the history. And the first question, can be avoided at the tax fraud? Yeah. If we eliminate the VAT, like in the US, if you have no VAT, you have no fraud. So that's an easy way.
Okay. Thank you very much.